Their punishment has never been just about the crime. It's always been about sending a message. And for much of history, the message sent to women was very different from the one sent to men. To understand why women faced unique punishments, you have to look at how society saw them. It wasn't about equality, it was about order. And women had a very specific role to play in that order. For centuries, in many cultures, a woman was not her own person. She belonged to someone else. First, she was her father's property. Then, she was her husband's. Her value was tied to her purity, her obedience, and her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Her actions didn't just reflect on her, they reflected on her family, her husband, her entire community. A man's honor was often measured by the behavior of his wife. If she stepped out of line, his reputation suffered. So, controlling women was about controlling social stability. This created a strange double standard. Women were seen as the guardians of morality. They were expected to be pious, modest, and gentle. They were the moral compass of the home. But at the same time, they were also seen as weaker, more emotional, less rational than men. They were considered more susceptible to temptation and sin. Think of the story of Adam and Eve. Eve was the one who listened to the serpent. She was the one who tempted Adam. This idea echoed through the centuries. It meant that women needed more guidance, more control, and when they failed, they needed to be corrected in a way that reinforced their place. So, when a woman committed a crime, the punishment often wasn't just about what she did. It was about the social rules she broke. A man who got into a drunken brawl might be fined, or put in the stocks for a few hours. It was a public nuisance, but a woman who was drunk and disorderly was seen as something much worse. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a failure as a woman. She had abandoned her modesty. She had shamed her husband. The punishment had to address that shame. This is why so many punishments for women were about public humiliation. It wasn't enough for her to pay a fine or spend a night in a cell. The community had to see her punished. They had to see the social order being restored. The punishment was a performance. It was a warning to other women. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is what happens when you bring shame upon us. The crimes themselves were often gendered. Men were punished for theft, assault, and treason. Women were too, of course, but there was a whole category of offenses that were almost exclusively female. Things like gossiping, nagging, or being a scold. These weren't violent crimes. They didn't destroy property, but they were seen as a threat to the natural order. A gossiping woman spread discord. A nagging wife undermined her husband's authority. These were attacks on the patriarchy itself in a small domestic way, and so they required a specific kind of response. The punishments were designed to fit the perceived female crime. If a woman's sin was her speech, the punishment would target her mouth. If her sin was sexual, the punishment would target her body and her reputation. It was all about reasserting control over the parts of a woman that society feared were uncontrollable: her tongue, her sexuality, her influence within the home. Even when men and women committed the same crime, the punishment could be vastly different. Take adultery. In many legal systems, a man's adultery was a minor offense, a private matter. It might be a sin, but it wasn't always a crime. But a woman's adultery was a catastrophe. It threatened the entire system of inheritance and property. A man needed to know his children were his own. A wife's affair called that into question, so her punishment was severe: public shaming, banishment, even death. The man she had the affair with often faced a lesser penalty. Her crime was seen as fundamentally more damaging to society. This foundation of control, shame, and social order is the key. The unique punishments women faced weren't random acts of cruelty. They were a logical, if brutal, extension of a world that saw women not as individuals, but as pillars holding up a very specific social structure. If one of those pillars cracked, it had to be repaired publicly and painfully to make sure the whole building didn't come crashing down. A woman's voice could be a dangerous thing. In a world run by men, a quiet woman was a good woman. An obedient woman was a good wife. But a woman who talked too much, who argued, who spread stories, or who challenged her husband's authority was a problem. She was a disruption. She was a scold. And for that, there were special tools. Two of the most famous punishments for unruly women were the scold's bridle and the ducking stool. These weren't about locking someone away. They were about public spectacle. They were about humiliation and silencing. They were designed specifically to punish crimes of the tongue. The scold's bridle, sometimes called a brank, was a horrifying device. It was an iron cage that fit over the head. Attached to the front was a metal plate, or a bit, that was inserted into the woman's mouth and pressed down on her tongue. Sometimes it was smooth, sometimes it was covered in spikes. It made speaking impossible. It was painful, it caused drooling and bleeding. It was, in the most literal sense, a way to silence a woman. But the physical pain was only part of the punishment. A woman forced to wear the bridle was often led through the streets by a leash, like an animal. People would gather to mock her, to throw rotten food at her. The message was clear. Your words are worthless. Your opinions are a nuisance. Your voice is so offensive that we have to physically restrain it. It stripped her of her dignity. It reduced her to a public spectacle of shame. The crime was speaking out of turn, and the punishment was the complete removal of her ability to speak at all. This wasn't just for women who started public arguments. It could be used on a wife whose husband complained she nagged him, or a woman accused of gossiping about her neighbors. Gossip was seen as a particularly female vice. It was viewed as a way women sowed chaos and undermined the social fabric from within their own homes. Men in power saw it as a kind of verbal poison. So, the cure was to lock up the source of that poison, the woman's mouth. Then there was the ducking stool. This was another instrument of public theater. The ducking stool was a chair attached to a long wooden arm, like a seesaw. The arm was built on the edge of a river or a pond. The woman was tied into the chair. The arm was then swung out over the water and she was plunged, or ducked, beneath the surface. Sometimes just once, sometimes repeatedly. The crowd would cheer. It was a form of entertainment. But for the woman in the chair, it was terrifying. It was a near drowning experience. The shock of the cold water, the inability to breathe, the feeling of complete helplessness. It was a physical and psychological ordeal. The official reason was often that the water would cool her heated temper. But the real reason was, again, public humiliation. It was a way of washing away her sin in the most visible way possible. Like the bridle, the ducking stool was used for scolds, shrews, and argumentative women. It was also sometimes used for brewers who made bad ale or bakers who sold bad bread, but its primary association was with punishing disorderly women. It was a way for the community to collectively say, your behavior is unacceptable, and we will all watch as you are punished for it. The ordeal wasn't over when she was pulled from the water. She would be left shivering, soaked, and utterly shamed in front of everyone she knew. What makes these punishments so unique is that there was no real equivalent for men. A man who was argumentative might get into a fist fight or be told to hold his tongue. He might be fined. But he wasn't subjected to instruments specifically designed to silence him or publicly dunk him for being too loud. A man's speech, even when angry or disruptive, was often seen as a sign of his authority or passion. A woman's was a sign of disorder. The scold's bridle and the ducking stool are perfect examples of how punishment was tailored to gender. The crime wasn't just breaking a law, it was violating a social role. The punishment aimed to correct that violation in the most direct way possible. You used your mouth to cause trouble? We will lock your mouth. You have a fiery, unruly temper? We will douse you with cold water. These devices weren't just about inflicting pain. They were about reestablishing control over the female voice and reminding everyone of the proper, silent place of women in society. A woman's body was never truly her own. It was a vessel for carrying on the family line. It was a symbol of her family's honor. Her sexuality was a community concern, tied up in ideas of property, inheritance, and purity. So, when it came to moral crimes, especially sexual ones, the punishments for women were deeply personal, public, and often brutal. The double standard was not a subtle thing, it was the law. Adultery is the clearest example. When a married man had an affair, it was often seen as a personal failing, a sin he would have to answer for with God. It might damage his reputation, but it rarely resulted in severe legal punishment. He might pay a fine, he might have to make a public apology, but his crime was considered a trespass against another man's property as wife. For a woman, adultery was a crime against the entire social order. It threw the legitimacy of her children into doubt. Or their husband's bloodline, it brought profound shame upon her family. Because her value was so tied to her fidelity, her unfaithfulness was seen as a complete betrayal of her purpose. The punishments reflected this. They were designed to permanently mark her as a fallen woman. Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter, captured this perfectly. Hester Prynne was forced to wear a red letter A on her chest for the rest of her life. While the book is fiction, the practice of public shaming was very real. Women accused of adultery or fornication were often forced to stand in the town square, sometimes on a platform or in the stocks for hours on end. They might have their heads shaved, a powerful symbol of lost femininity and public disgrace. They might be forced to wear a special hood or a sign detailing their crime. In some places, the punishment was even more direct. A woman might be paraded through the streets, sometimes naked, while people jeered and threw things at her. This was called a cucking stool parade, or a skimmington ride, a noisy, humiliating procession meant to expose her sin to the world. The goal was to make her an outcast. Her reputation was destroyed. Her social life was over. The man involved, meanwhile, often faded into the background, his role in the affair minimized or ignored. This focus on female sexuality extended beyond married women. Having a child outside of marriage was a catastrophe for a woman. There was no social safety net. She was on her own and she faced immense stigma. She was seen as morally corrupt, a source of shame for her family. The child was labeled a bastard with few legal rights. This pressure was so intense that it led to one of the most tragic crimes of the era, infanticide. A desperate, terrified single woman who killed her newborn child did so to avoid a life of utter ruin. But if she was caught, the law showed no mercy. Infanticide was treated as murder, and the punishment was almost always death. The society created an impossible situation for these women and then condemned them for their desperate solutions. There was little thought given to the circumstances that led her to that point of the lack of support, the fear of ostracism, the abandonment by the child's father. She alone bore the full weight of the moral and legal consequences. Even prostitution was punished with this same focus on public shame. While both the prostitute and her client were breaking moral codes, it was the woman who was punished publicly. She might be whipped at the cart's tail, dragged through town as an example to others. She might be branded with a hot iron, a permanent mark of her profession. Her clients, especially if they were powerful men, were rarely named and almost never punished. The problem was seen not as male demand, but as female corruption. All these punishments, the scarlet letters, the public parades, the shaved heads, were about more than just the act of sex. They were about reinforcing control over female bodies. A woman's choices about her own body had consequences for the entire community, and so the community felt it had the right to regulate and punish those choices. The punishment was a way to cleanse the community of her sin. By making her a public spectacle, they were symbolically casting out the disorder she had created. Her shame was a warning to all other women. This is the price of stepping outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Of all the crimes a woman could be accused of, witchcraft was perhaps the most terrifying. It was a charge that combined fear, superstition, and deep-seated misogyny. While men were sometimes accused of being warlocks, the vast majority of those targeted during the great witch hunts of Europe and America were women. Witchcraft became, in many ways, the ultimate female crime. Why were women the primary targets? It goes back to the old ideas about their nature. Women were seen as the weaker sex, not just physically, but morally. They were believed to be more easily swayed by the devil's promises of power, wealth, or revenge. Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden was the template. If the first woman could be tricked by a serpent, then her daughters were surely vulnerable to the devil himself. There were also social reasons. Many of the accused were women who lived on the margins of society. They were often poor, elderly, and widowed. They didn't have a husband or a father to protect them. They might have been healers or midwives, women who possessed knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and the human body. This knowledge, which was outside the control of male doctors and priests, could be a source of suspicion. If a child was born with a defect or a patient died unexpectedly, it was easy to blame the midwife. Her knowledge was twisted into evidence of a dark pact. A woman who was argumentative, who didn't conform to expectations of female submissiveness, was also a target. A sharp-tongued woman who cursed at a neighbor after an argument might find herself accused of witchcraft if that neighbor's cow suddenly fell ill. Her words were seen as having a real malevolent power. The charge of witchcraft was a powerful weapon to use against any woman who didn't fit in. The process of a witch trial was itself a form of punishment. The accusation alone could ruin a woman's life. Once accused, she was stripped of all dignity. She would be arrested and imprisoned in horrific conditions. The interrogation was often brutal, involving sleep deprivation and torture, all designed to extract a confession. Of the witch man's shit. One of the most unique and cruel aspects. The accused woman would be publicly stripped and searched for a witch's mark or devil's mark. This could be any mole, birthmark, or unusual spot on her body. It was believed to be the spot where the devil or his demons had suckled her. These marks were then pricked with a long pin. If the spot didn't bleed or if the woman felt no pain, it was considered proof of witchcraft. Of course, the person doing the pricking could easily manipulate the outcome. This invasive, humiliating search was a violation designed to shame and dehumanize the accused. Another infamous test was swimming the witch. The accused woman's hands and feet would be tied together, and she would be thrown into a lake or river. The logic was that water, being a pure element, would reject a witch, so if she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. It was a no-win situation. If she floated, she would be pulled out and executed. If she was sank, she would likely drown, proving her innocence only after she was already dead. There was no male equivalent for this kind of pseudo-religious fatal test. The final punishment for those found guilty was almost always death. Hanging was common in England and its American colonies. In continental Europe, the preferred method was burning at the stake. This was a particularly symbolic death. The fire was meant to purify the witch's soul and cleanse the community of her evil influence. It was the ultimate public spectacle, a gruesome warning to anyone, especially any woman, who dared to step outside the bounds of religious and social orthodoxy. The witch hunts were an extreme example, but they grew from the same soil as the Scold's Bridle and the Scarlet Letter. They were the result of a society that feared female power, female knowledge, and female independence. The witch was the ultimate unruly woman. She was not just a nag or an adulteress, she was a traitor to God and humanity. The punishments she faced were designed to be as extreme as her perceived crime, a final, fiery assertion of patriarchal control over the female body and spirit. The Scold's Bridle is a museum piece. The ducking stool is a historical curiosity. We no longer burn women at the stake for witchcraft. It's easy to look back at these punishments and feel relieved that we've moved past such barbarism. The tools of punishment have certainly changed, but have the underlying ideas that created them really disappeared? The echoes of these unique punishments for women can still be heard today, just in a different form. The most obvious parallel is in the court of public opinion, which is now a global digital space. Public shaming is alive and well. A woman who speaks her mind forcefully online is often not debated, but insulted. She's called shrill, a shrew, or worse. The attacks are rarely about the substance of her argument. They are about her tone, her audacity to have a strong opinion. This is the modern version of punishing a scold. The goal is the same: to silence her, to make her an example for other women who might dare to speak up. Slut shaming is the digital Scarlet Letter. A woman's sexual history, real or imagined, is used as a weapon to discredit and humiliate her. Revenge porn, the sharing of intimate images without consent, is a brutal form of public shaming that almost exclusively targets women. The aim is to destroy her reputation, to brand her with a digital mark of shame that can follow her forever. Like the public parades of the past, it's a way of punishing a woman for her sexuality, for stepping outside the bounds of what some consider acceptable moral behavior. The man who takes or shares the photo often faces far less social condemnation. These attitudes also bleed into our justice system. Think about how victims of sexual assault are often treated. Their past relationships, what they were wearing, whether they had been drinking, all of it is put on trial. The victim is often implicitly accused of bringing the crime upon herself. This intense scrutiny is a form of punishment for not adhering to a certain idea of proper female behavior. It's a modern interrogation where a woman's moral character is examined as evidence. The fear of the nonconforming woman, the one who fueled the witch hunts, hasn't vanished either. A woman in a position of power is judged by different standards than a man. A man is a boss, a woman is bossy. He is assertive, she is aggressive, he is passionate, she is emotional. These are subtle but powerful ways of enforcing old gender roles. They are verbal bridles designed to keep women in their place. A woman who is too ambitious, too independent, too different can still be seen as a threat to the established order. Even the pressure surrounding motherhood has echoes of the past. The immense judgment placed on mothers about working, about staying home, about how they raise their children is a modern form of community policing. The idea that a woman's primary role is tied to her children and her home is still very powerful. When a woman is seen to fail in that role, the social punishment can be intense. So, have things changed? Yes, absolutely. The legal systems in many parts of the world no longer have separate codified punishments for women. The physical instruments of torture and shame are gone. A woman cannot be legally ducked for nagging her husband. That is undeniable progress. But the social attitudes that created those punishments have been slow to die. The impulse to control female speech, to police female sexuality, and to punish women who defy social expectations is still with us. The punishments are no longer iron and water, but shame and ostracism delivered through tweets and tabloids instead of stocks and pyres. The tools are more sophisticated, the reach is wider. But the fundamental message that there is a right way and a wrong way to be a woman, and that those who choose the wrong way will be punished for it, is a story that is still being told.